Hollow Knight is not a difficult game. Sure, the boss fights can be challenging, the environments offer a rewarding experience, and the discovery of new NPCs is always a good feeling, but the game itself, as a whole, is not difficult. What Hollow Knight is, to some people, is tedious. And this is not a bad thing, depending on who you ask. The best things that I've heard from people who are simply infatuated with this game are as follows. After a certain point, you are free to explore at your own pace. The feeling of progression is pretty fair, as in the rate at which you get better at the game while also upgrading your character, and the feeling that flows through your entire body when you finally thwart a primal aspect. But most importantly, above all else, the game does not fault you for things that are beyond your control. In other words, when it comes to combat or traversal, if you take damage, it's no one else's fault but your own for simply not getting good. It's your choice if you choose to engage in a fight or try to traverse an obstacle, and it's your fault if you judge it inaccurately. My mind is kind of weird. It thinks like a completionist, yet I only actually complete very few games. Pretty much every single time I start a new game, I'm all for being immersed in the experience. That's kind of the point of a game, right? To suck you in and make you forget you're even playing a game. However, when I get to a point in a game where I can start to pick it apart and see how the pieces fit, I start to think about what I find worth doing. If I find that whatever late game completion criteria is just plain old not fun, that's usually where I end up drawing the line. Why would I subject myself to doing something I don't enjoy doing just to obtain 100%? Which brings me to the following point. Doing things you don't like doing. There is a significant difference between gamers who are okay with doing things that they don't like and ones that are not. Hollow Knight pushes the boundaries of what it means to just put up with something for the sake of experiencing an overall good game experience. We're not talking about things like glitches and bugs. Well, we are actually talking about bugs, but anyways, we're talking about deliberate design choices that make or break the experience for a lot of people. I just mentioned some of the biggest reasons for why people enjoy Hollow Knight's gameplay, but the biggest complaint that I've come to notice by far is that the game forces you to walk the same long, annoying path every time you lose in a fight. That means that when you die, you end up all the way back at whatever the last bench you sat on was and are left to walk all the way back to wherever you wanted to go in order to try again. It's not too far off from the feeling I get when I walk into a room for the second time and forget what I originally went there for. Again, in case it wasn't obvious, this is not fun for a lot of people, because the game is punishing you for losing in a much more significant manner than most other games do. But does this mean that the game isn't worth playing simply because it makes you do this? To some people, apparently it is. But I think it's important to explain just what kind of experience Hollow Knight really can be, especially for people who maybe aren't exactly used to this kind of gameplay. Because I play games so often on Switch, I've grown pretty attached to games like Super Mario Baby World, where you play as this stupid little baby in this baby-ass game made for babies that expects you to go along a predetermined path laid out for you only for an elite gamer such as myself to come along and completely circumvent their intentions, even though they definitely did intend for that, because that's just what good game design is, man. My point is, I get this really good feeling when I'm playing a game, and it's obvious that I'm playing it way differently than the usual demographic, regardless of the developer's intention. It's like they give me the chance to completely bypass the section of the game they designed by just simply utilizing the tools given to me to their fullest potential. You can just zip zap zoop, skip up to the very top of this ledge and skip the whole fucking level because you're just that good at the game and you feel so great when you do it. But then my completionist brain kicks in and it's like, okay, I guess I'll go back just to make sure I didn't miss anything. Hollow Knight doesn't give you all of your tools right off the bat. Hell, you practically start from zero, jumping down into a chasm with no name, no purpose, and nothing more than an old withered nail and a few basic moves. The game makes you work for your progression, even slowly teaching you to get better at the game without really teaching you anything at all. This isn't unheard of in games, far from it, especially in older, more retro titles where having a story was restricted to the first 30 seconds or within a game's manual. However, for it to be used in this capacity within a relatively open world game, it kind of is. And no, I don't mean open world like a game where you have to sift through 7 different menus just to find a single item you want to upgrade within a complicated EXP system. I mean that the game is vast and free to roam, and only gives you upgrades if you really earn them. Not by grinding, but by discovering. Once you move past a certain point, you're free to explore everything this game has to offer. Despite that freedom, if you want to get anywhere, you have to work for that feeling. There are tons of moments where you can just waltz into any area and be hella unprepared, or if you're playing more carefully, you can pass by an area that you really want to get into, but you just can't because of your limited resources. But then, when you finally do get that tool or special move, you're like, oh my god, now I can finally get to this fucking worm. And if you decide to forego finding some other way to go and attempt to just try and power through it, you're gonna have to expect to go through those sections over and over and over, and to live through that experience again and again and again and again. I think this discussion would be better held up by looking at some other indie games that people consider fun and aesthetically pleasing, but also incredibly difficult. And for starters, Cuphead.
This is the Dark Souls of 2D platformers.
Dude, shut up, okay? Shut. I did not go into playing Cuphead expecting to enjoy it as much as I did. It is a perfect combination of pick up and play gameplay and challenging scenarios, and it not only has one of the most charming stylistic choices I've ever seen in a game, but it blew me away based on just how easily it tests your ability to consider yourself good at video games. Celeste is another game that, although I don't have much experience with it, I know is a surprisingly accessible game. It is ruthless in its platforming challenges, but like Hollow Knight, indirectly teaches you to get better at the game as you advance further in the story, and has a strong emphasis on taking your time, even if you're struggling in the main game. In all of these games, the fact is that regardless of whatever way you decide to go, you're going to have to experience the feeling of failure over and over again. But only 2 of these games are supplied with an immediate redemption period. And I think you can guess that Hollow Knight is not the one that has that. Generally speaking, in video games, when it comes to confronting an enemy, the point of the game is to learn the enemy's attack patterns and then to counteract those patterns with whatever you've got. If you lose at any point, you are to immediately go back in and fight again using what you now know. In games like Cuphead, death is ingrained into the experience. You should practically be expecting to die in order to use what you learned in that encounter the next time you hit the retry button. In Hollow Knight, again, a similar thing can be said, but when you die, not only are you sent all the way back to wherever the last opportunity to save your progress was, in classic Dark Souls / The Surge / Jedi Fallen Order / motherfucking baby game fashion, you also have added to that the incentive to go back to the exact area you died in order to recover your lost resources before you die again. What happens if you die one more time or quit out of the game before you get your money back? Poof! Gone! Say goodbye to that nice upgrade you wanted. Imagine if shit like that happened in Cuphead. Unless you're a speedrunner, you'd never buy anything ever again. This, of course, is where the enjoyment of both games starts to differ, because you're running into what reward system the player is looking for. If the player finds exploration and overcoming challenges to be a rewarding experience and are okay with coming to terms about the fact that they messed up, that it's their own fault they lost progress, they're probably going to enjoy Hollow Knight, even if it may take them longer to beat it. Cuphead and Celeste feed more so into this immediate reward psychology. You have to go back in and try just one more time. Even if you don't have the right weapon layout or power-ups or whatever, you can blame the level design or the attack patterns all you want, but afterwards, you just have to go back in and give it one more go. It can be described as almost addictive how badly these games can rope you into the feeling of getting beaten with a wooden spoon over and over. However, despite this analogy, the big thing to point out here is that there is no real punishment for losing in these games. If you call punishment starting over at the beginning of the level, then sure, but I wouldn't call that anything more than a consequence, so to speak. Even though I just said you're pretty much safe from any real progression halting within those 2 games, with Hollow Knight, if you find that you keep losing and honestly don't think you can beat that boss, that's totally fine. Because of what I mentioned earlier about the game being relatively free roaming, most of the time your progress is not inherently hindered by you not being able to do this one thing. Go explore somewhere else and find some other upgrade that you might want to use. Make your weapon more powerful, or go save up some more money for that one really cool thing you wanted to buy. The game does a really good job at making sure you're not shoehorned into doing one thing over another. But since we're already comparing it to other games, even though games like Dark Souls offer this too, I don't like comparing it to Dark Souls outside of the obvious borrowed mechanics, simply because it isn't laid out like how Dark Souls is. You might get clapped by a super hard boss, but chances are that it's because you chose to engage in that fight. In Dark Souls, you'll get clapped for simply walking 2 inches too far to the right. You never have to worry about stamina or how much gear you're wearing. The amount of health you lose doesn't fluctuate nearly as much based on the enemy's attack power, and I'm pretty sure you never get a double jump in Dark Souls. For both games, however, you have a set path that you're encouraged to take for story purposes, but you don't necessarily have to take it right away if you don't want to. There are prerequisites for certain things in certain places, sure, but realistically, you can experience them at whatever pace you want.
At this point, you're probably wondering where I stand opinion-wise with this analysis. Personally, in case it wasn't obvious, I love Cuphead, and from the little bit that I've played of Celeste, I've been enjoying it. I also think that Hollow Knight is really fun and really cool.
The art style is super appealing to me, and I really like the use of bold lines and perspective to really jump out against the complex backgrounds. The music's fantastic and fits into its respective areas very well, and the characterization of a desolate world made underground by insects is a novel and interesting concept.
I honestly have no real complaints. Except for this one.
I hear this game is often referred to as a Metroidvania style game due to its incredible emphasis on exploration and the amount of backtracking that's a necessary part of the core gameplay. I guess you could say this is my first real foray into Metroidvania style games, so don't peg me as some kind of expert on those kind of games. I've mentioned multiple times how Hollow Knight gives you a lot of freedom to explore and discover at your own pace, but that can come at a cost. Right before the halfway point of the game, I hit a spot where I was starting to think less about what's next to do and more so about how much there is left to do. I didn't realize how big the game actually was until I zoomed out on the map and looked at all the empty space that was still left to fill. And in that moment, my perspective of the game had changed. I was now experiencing both sides of this argument at the same time, and that was a weird feeling. I was enjoying my time, but I couldn't stop shaking this feeling that I was in way over my head than I initially suspected. Remember when I talked about fulfilling completion criteria in the beginning? Yeah, this tends to happen to me with larger games. Call this a character flaw if you want, or whatever, but I generally want to experience everything a game has to offer, and so I get so wrapped up in what can be done that once I realize what I'm getting myself into, I get overwhelmed and burnt out. Essentially, the more optional things there are to do, the more my journey starts to feel like it's stagnating, and if I decide to press on and continue, I start feeling more like I'm going through a checklist instead of just allowing myself to be immersed in the world. However, despite all of this, every time I went back in to play the game some more, I always found myself playing for several hours on end. I might be a Legend of Zelda fan, but I don't need a game to be linear to have fun. I like being able to discover things and feel accomplished for doing so. Lack of direction does not equal a lack of control. You can have fun experiencing a heavily scripted game, but you will run into spots where you're stuck doing something you hate, because there's nothing more that gamers love than being told what to do, especially when it involves waiting. Despite this nagging feeling of mine constantly persisting even up to the final boss, I did eventually beat the game, doing almost everything that was available to me, aside from the more involved additional DLC stuff like Grim Troop or Godmaster. I was happy to have experienced it, but leading up to that point, I couldn't shake this thought that once I'm done with the main story, I could finally move on from this game. And in a way, it sullied my experience a bit. This may not make sense to you, as I'm sure some of you are okay with playing or even completing games like these multiple times over. Right now, I don't think that there's a really solid way out there to prove that a game is overstaying its welcome, but for myself, it's usually based on judging that feeling I get. I did do a lot of optional things, and I did find them rewarding, like everything to do with Millibel the Banker or with the Collector in the Tower of Love. These are things that I didn't have to do to beat the main story, but I did them anyway. They were fun and creative little additions to the world and to my gameplay experience, but they didn't save me from feeling like it was time to move on. Again, I enjoyed my time with the game, but with this video being finished, this is probably the last time I'll ever play it.
Well, there you have it. All in all, you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, Addy, I mean, I get what you're saying. You know, sure, the game can be tedious, but doesn't that still make the game hard? And in a way, sure it does. The game could also still be difficult for people who maybe aren't exactly as experienced with video games or with 2D platformers, but in my case, like in my opinion, as someone who grew up on mostly Nintendo games, it's really not that bad. Mario Odyssey could be hard to beat for a toddler, but it's hard to say that that establishes it as a difficult game. I'll go back and touch on that in a bit, but for right now, what have we learned? Hollow Knight's main story can be 2 to 3 times as long as Cuphead or Celeste's, but does that make the game any harder than those 2 games? Is the extra length due to the expansive world, or the fact that there's just so much backtracking upon death? The meat and potatoes of it is, it's just like Hades or Dark Souls or Ninja Gaiden or any other game that's considered hard. Play the game and get used to the mechanics. Then, once you do, become more adapted to whatever the game throws at you. Some games might have steeper learning curves than others, but if the game was developed correctly, and you learn to utilize those tools as best as possible, then anything that's being asked of you within the game is possible. Ultimately, I think it's safe to say that difficulty is subjective, but in my case, the things that I listed were the most challenging parts of the game for me to overcome. And with that, I think that's all I had left to say. So, thanks for watching to the very end of this video. I know I said it was going to take a while, and it did, but overall I'm pretty happy with the end result, and I hope you were too. Stick around to the very end of this video for some extra bonus content, but I hope you thought my video was entertaining or insightful. Every little bit of interaction can help me learn and grow as a content creator. So if you're interested in my journey or just want to see more videos, then consider sharing this video with someone who maybe is already a fan of Hollow Knight, or is interested in playing it for the first time. Of course, feel free to subscribe to the channel, but if you leave a comment down below, I can get back to you on any questions you may have had for me regarding my playthrough, or things you think I may have missed in the video. Overall, go ahead and do that, and on your way out, if you don't mind leaving a like, if you think this video deserves it, I would greatly appreciate it. And now, for those of you that decided to stick around until after my long spiel, just for you, I'm gonna go ahead and list off a few things that I would personally like to see changed in Hollow Knight, and this isn't, like, anything, super controversial. I mean, it just didn't fit in anywhere else in the script, so I'm slapping it on the end here. I'm just gonna go ahead and rapid fire these off. I'm not a game designer, by the way, so and no iteration of it whatsoever, so take this with a grain of salt, but sorry, but here it is. Make it so that you can fast travel between benches, not the stag tunnels. The stag is a cool character with an interesting backstory, but it would be a lot more seamless that way, and it would definitely save a lot of time. Add a charm that gives you some kind of counter ability, but don't make it too powerful. Think Smash Brothers counterattack, but make it so that it has a cooldown or something. I feel like there's way too many charms that more or less just act in the background, so having charms that actively give you extra combat abilities would be nice to have. And lastly, the one thing that I had more trouble with than the actual final boss of the game, nerf the Trial of the Fool. Oh my fucking god!
I looked at the camera.